Welcome to all my lovely viewers to another episode of the Political Field podcast. My name is Matthew Field and this is the Political Field. We have an incredibly important episode today because I'm joined by Comrade Aubrey Tshabalala. He is the General Secretary of the Communication Workers Union, and this is an incredibly important episode because trade unionism is a vital part of the South African economy and of economies as a whole. And it's also one of the most misunderstood factors that play a role in how the South African economic machine moves. So today we're going to be dispelling some of the myths about trade unions. We're going to be talking about why trade unions are essential in an economy like South Africa's and in any economy in general. And then lastly, we're going to touch on some of the work that the Communication Workers Union is doing. But before we get into all of that, maybe Comrade Aubrey could, for the benefit of the audience, give us a brief overview of what a trade union does and what the role of the General Secretary is in a trade union.
No, thank you very much. I think the trade union, in simple terms, is a tool or a legal tool to represent workers, but also to fight the battle for workers, because trade union by law has been instituted to be a representing body for workers at workplace. So it becomes the sole representation in a true sense of things. We know that other companies will form things like your company forums and so forth, but those are limited in terms of what can they do, what can they bargain for, and what is it that can tend to a particular extent. You'll have law firms that advertise all over the TVs telling workers that they can represent them, and so on and so forth. The truth of the matter is that they cannot access workplace. The only legal institution that can do that, it becomes the trade union. But what is also important is that the trade union remains the most democratized institution, which its owners are basically workers. If you look at the president of the union, is supposed to be a worker. He's not someone that you elect and then he becomes a president and he stays there. He's a worker who's employed at a particular factory, who will serve for a particular period. And once that period is over, it's either be re-elected or he goes back to his workplace. Is going to continue to earn his salary as a worker in that particular factory he was employed. So that's very critical, because some people confuse this and think that the president will be some CEO of some top guy that's not touchable. He's basically a worker. The general secretary is, on the other end, is also an elected official of a union. But the difference then, it becomes a person that assumes the position of the administration part of the organization. Therefore, you have to remove completely from the capitalist influence, which is your employers, so that he can effectively run the administrative part, whether to take companies head on, legally in courts and so forth, to initiate strikes and all of those things. So the general secretary employs by the workers themselves to say, run for this period, and you'll be able to then lead us administrative. Other unions choose to employ that person at a full-time basis, will from time to time account to the general working class in terms of the structures of that particular union. That's basically what a trade union does, and in short, that's how it operates.
I think that's a really good introduction as to the structure of how unions in this country work. And I think what would be good to emphasize is how democratic they are compared to something that a corporate might set up, internally, or going to a law firm and trying to organize that way. One thing that I've noticed, being a politically minded South African who reads the news a lot, is that trade unions are often demonized in the media and in popular economic conversation. And the mainstream idea is that, trade unions, slow down business, they're becoming increasingly irrelevant, and they make it difficult to operate and to start, and they make it expensive to do business. I just want to explore ways in which that isn't necessarily true. So, is it, this common myth that we're told that, a trade union makes it more difficult to do business? Do you believe that that's true? And why is it that idea has gotten into people's heads?
Well, firstly, we get those criticism on almost every day. But I get excited when we get those criticism because it means that we're doing very well in terms of the role that we need to play. And you can't falter those who are blaming us. Naturally, those who are blaming us are those who own means of production. In other words, the owners of factories, the firms, the economy of the country. And they want to continue to get maximize profit at all times. And to maximize profit, you've got to exploit. And who do you exploit is those who are now going to turn the wheels of economy, whom we call workers in general. It doesn't matter whether a worker is coming from university or is uneducated worker, but it ought to be exploited to get to a particular level of a profit. Then a trade union, on the other hand, it becomes this voice of those who are voiceless and powerless, meaning workers who do not own means of production. And when a union raise important issues, particularly now in this crisis of the COVID-19 pandemic, the issues of health and safety, the issues of testing and all of those things. And the business wants to run its business. It doesn't want to be disturbed by anything. And the trade union becomes that voice to say, you cannot do 1, 2, 3 if you did not do ABC. And you ought to, as a capitalist, find a way of demonizing, criticizing, particularly to young minds, a young worker, so that those people do not go to workplace with an idea that the union is a safe heavens for the workers, but you have a negative attitude towards it because you view it as a main obstacle to slow down business. I'll make an example. When business maximize profit, like your telecom and others, when they've reached a ceiling in terms of ideas, for them to maximize their bonuses as the employers, as the CEOs and everyone else, what they do, they then retrench workers. So if you don't have a strong voice opposing that, you'll have these capitalists who will continue to cut jobs. And mind you, when you cut jobs, you are hurting the very same economy that you want to get something out of it, because the buying power of South Africans gets weakened on a daily basis because workers are retrenched. So it only becomes a trade union that basically saves the economy by trying to stop this retrenchment, minimizing the greed, because greed will always be there of these owners of means of production, minimizing the greed of these exploiters to a point where workers get out something. You can take many cases, for example, the ShopRite checkers. The CEO there is one of the highest paid CEO in the country. But look at their workers. Last time they were striking for that they should not buy their own uniform. A worker with almost at a point of getting a minimum wage is also expected to get a decent uniform that he has to buy for himself. They went on strike for that. If it was not for the trade unions in this instance, those battles could have not been fought. And we see with our minds today, people literally live in the squalors. And they are working for your platinum, your gold mines. It is trade unions that pushes those battles. So it's very important that capitalists, those who have crass materialism, ought to criticize trade union. And once they stop criticizing, I'll be the first persons that get worried. It means that we are no longer doing our job.
That's a good point. You know, if they weren't criticizing you, then it would be a warning signal that they don't fear you. And perhaps a bit of fear is what makes a trade union successful. Going back to what you said about this tendency of South African companies when they, perhaps if they become a bit intellectually lazy where they don't innovate anymore, they just retrench to try and boost up short-term profits. I think this is indicative of a larger thing that has been going on across the world. Businesses are run in the interest of shareholders, and this idea of what is in the shareholders' interest has shifted over the decades to be more short-term. So businesses have essentially become a short-term operation where they're no longer considering, what are we going to do in 20 and 30 years from now? It's more, they're willing to go into massive amounts of debts to be able to pay dividends to shareholders today, and and other unsustainable business practices. So would you agree in saying that trade unions are one of the few organizations that compels the corporate world to think long-term instead of short-term in apparent shareholder interests, which isn't actually good for the long run in the company?
Absolutely. For various reasons, though, you find that the shareholders, they're looking to build in terms of the short-term objectives. Why is that? Is because we are in the digital space now, where the business ideas do not stay longer at the top level. They suddenly things change. For us in South Africa, you will be surprised by saying that by year 2000, only the rich had cell phones, and it was seen as the elitist. This is recent. It was seen as the elitist, gadgets. But today, a person who does not have a cell phone is a person that has been totally isolated into the broader community in terms of access, and it's called one of those human needs. So, coming back to your question, you find the shareholders, because of their desire for greed and desire for profit, they will look at the short terms, because knowing that anything could happen. Now, trade union comes in there very effectively to say that you need a company that will continuously reskill and upskill workers, so that as and when the market shifts, workers are more equipped to adapt to the new changes and so forth. So the reskilling and upskilling also requires the employer to spend some money into workers. And that is not something that they really like. I mean, so many things have drastically changed. You look at the space of media where we are operating. Newspaper was the thing. We know that our fathers used to sit on the Sunday morning, go through all the newspapers. It's no longer the same. With the COVID-19, they sort of vanished. Even at the airports now, they're no longer printing. So we have moved to the digital space. How do you deal with the impact of those workers who are selling newspapers, whom were perhaps not be viewed as workers, but vendors to somewhat extent? How do you deal with that particular question? That's the role of a trade union in a broader scheme of things in the economy space. And here in South Africa, we had set up in 1994 to 96 a thing called Network, where business and labor, together with civics, sit together and agreeing on a number of things, how to drive the economy forward. But as you have correctly pointed out, then we have these ones, whom we call them the investors, whom we call the shareholders, want to run away from these things because they view that as hampering their fast freeway into maximizing profit and delaying all their things that they can do in a shorter space time and so forth. But all of these things indicates to us two things: that trade unions are very critical now and into the future. But secondly, the capitalist system as we know it today is collapsing. It's actually failing. We have seen with in 2008, when there was an economic meltdown. We have seen it is going through now up until this point in time. We do need a serious revolution, if it's not reforms, around our economy so that it can take us forward. I'm not talking South Africa now. I'm just saying globally. It's very important that we see how to channel those things. But that also, a key element to play this, you ought to have your political ideological party, which in this sense in South Africa, you can rely on institutions like South African Communist Party. Others we might view other political parties as vehicles. But I'm saying those who are at the center of the economy is workers. Those who can drive the bosses to a point of an agreement is fundamentally workers. And it cannot be the drivers if workers themselves are disorganized. So workers need to form and organize themselves. How do they do that? They have a trade union to guard against it.
You've spoken of workers as being the drivers of the economy, but I think it's, we must also realize that the nature of what a worker is changing a lot in the fourth industrial revolution. And this also ties into, what you were saying, like perhaps the reason why shareholders are being more short-sighted is because the economy is changing so much, and so they don't want to stick around in a particular investment. So when trade unions first started existing in the Industrial Revolution, the definition of a worker was, someone who worked in a clothing factory and a steel mill. But now the definition of a worker is an Uber delivery driver and a software developer. And so another argument that often gets put forward as to why, trade unions might be becoming irrelevant is that, you don't really have workers anymore. If you look at Uber and Uber as an example, Uber doesn't employ anyone. We have this increasing trend of people being contractors, where when they're not actually employed. I can't even think of the way to describe it, because it is actually just such a gross contract that's being entered into, and it's so inherently unfair, because it's all of the downsides of being employed and none of the benefits. So what do you think needs to be the strategy of trade unions going forward, where you don't have people being formally employed anymore, and instead we're operating in this gig economy, where you sort of work as a contractor? How are trade unions going to adapt when the definition of being a worker is changing?
Well, you've mentioned a very important word there, adapt or die. From the first industrial revolution, there was absolutely nothing. So the things that came about urbanization was the first industrial, where they have steam engines and so forth, and it goes to electronics, electrical on the second industrial. The third one was computers. In all those changes, and then I'll come to this last one, because myth is created around the change of the industrialization. Ours, we have to look at how to adapt, and I'm happy that the president of this country did appoint me as part of labor into the 4IR commission, so that we can be able to discuss and expand on these things. When the electricity was introduced in America, there was a serious strike. People were fighting then to say electricity will destroy jobs of those who are creating candle lights, and it will take away the money and so forth. But at that time, it was for those people to look at the broader idea of electricity. How do you upscale the people who are making candles to be the people that are working in the electric factory? How do you have a mass-based employment to grow that? Because today, there's no life without electricity. And so you see that there was a slightly missed opportunity there. The trade union that I'm leading today, Communication Workers Union, with COSATU, entered in a serious battle around 92 to 96 on the introduction of cell phones. To say we cannot have cell phones, these things are impractical, are going to take our jobs and so forth. But today, there's no one without a cell phone except the poor of the poor. So it's another opportunity that, my view, have been missed by trade unions, of making sure at that time that unions become the shareholders of the newly introduced cell phone companies. So we have learned throughout that period. Now we are in the fourth industrial revolution. And I'm saying, here's a person creating an app called Uber. And he then creates a myth that people are going to be entrepreneurs. But it's basically a new employment. It is an employment. This employment says to you, you will be a worker, but you must bring your own tools of work which meet certain requirements. And these tools of work, what do they call them? It's a cell phone and a car. So they must meet certain requirements by Uber. And then you'll be allocated routes that exist anyway. These roads, you pay them a disc. They are paid by taxpayers and so forth. So they allocate you routes to say you are an Uber, you'll be called with a device from this point to that point. And this is how you're going to charge a person. In that charge, we are now going to give you a share, which is your salary. And now Uber workers are not organized because there was a myth that they are self-employed. There was a myth that they are entrepreneurs. So they viewed themselves as owning something. Yet in reality, they own absolutely nothing. They are employed. But if they can organize themselves, nationally and globally, they will be able to make certain demands under trade unionism to say, we can be able to engage Uber, who represent Uber in the region in Africa, who represent Uber in the local in South Africa, who represent Uber globally. And once you come to that point, you are able now to say, does Uber comply with the labor regulations of the LRA in South Africa? Then you begin to say, how do you now make sure that Uber complies with the laws of each and every country as you go along? Amongst those is security issues, because we have seen a number of reports where people have been, adapted through Uber, where people have been robbed and so on and so forth, which are workers versus the customers. So you need to look at all those sides. So it does not only end there. I can expand and talk about Netflix. Netflix is a new broadcaster that has no building in our country. Let's start here in South Africa. They have no building. They have no mass employment like your multi-choice, like your SABC does. They pay no broadcasting levy. They have absolutely no regulations. They are not compelled to do the local content or whatsoever. They give us whatever content they want to give us, and ours is to pay, and they leave. We are calling for regulations in the OTTs, over the top services, which is Netflix, Showmax, Facebook, and so forth, so that amongst others, they play a significant role in the development of economy of our country by employing, by paying the necessary fees, like your broadcasting levy fee, and also by building infrastructure. They can't just take and leave. And there are people who argue, how do you control that? You can't control these people on the internet and so forth. You go to China, they are easily managed. They are controlled. Even Google is controlled in China. You go to countries such as Russia, but we are saying, let us not have an overreach policies that will go to a point of dictatorship. But let's have policies that will become friendly business-wise, but also be able to boost the economy of the country by creating jobs, building the infrastructure, and so forth. People must have a freedom of expression in these areas. The Ubers and all of them create a market that is fertile to develop such that. But you don't end there. You say, how do you then boost our local talent? We have young people who have ideas of creating these apps in South Africa. Others, they might have not reached university level. Others are in universities, but they are fear. They've all come to me and say, for me to have what they call a security or a protection in terms of I'm running out of the good word for it, but basically of the intellectual property, if I were to use that word. Because in the industry itself, once you have the idea, it doesn't stay long with you. Somebody else might take that idea and modify. So you need a country that will begin to support our young people that have innovations to get into the space and build their own companies from scratch. Your YouTubes and so forth are actually some of these apps can be established in South Africa to build the economy. So you need that. So that's where the trade union will play a significant role as a union to mobilize those workers that are assumed not to be workers.
So you speak about, the potential South Africa has to start new businesses, especially in this digital realm. But one of the main criticisms, perhaps one of the other myths that is popular about trade unions is that it makes it increasingly difficult to actually start a business. So, you mentioned a lot of the regulations that trade unions often call for. So a person who isn't a fan of trade unions would turn around and say, with all of these regulations that you're calling for, with high minimum wages, with really organized workforces, is it not going to make it hard for someone to start a business? Because, a very small company versus a massive one, like, let's say I wanted to start a retailer and, compare like me, if I'm a small business versus something like Macro would find it easier to deal with a trade union and all the regulations versus a really small business. So do you think it does make it harder to start a new enterprise if you have a lot of trade unionism?
Well, most of those criticism coming from two types of people. One is just a person who's lazy to read, who just wants to criticize without reading. The other one is just a person who just negative about trade unionism. That's the two types of people that we need to deal with. When we fought for a minimum wage and it's regulated is for everyone to see, it has exemption for business that cannot afford to employ people. So you apply for that exemption. So when you open a business, it is a bad idea that you open a business and you are lazy to read documents that are presented before you. Amongst them is Labor Relations Act. There's nothing stopping. I mean, you might have a helper at home and you are earning 5,000 rand. You obviously will not be able to pay 3,500 as a minimum wage. You apply for exemption and you pay that work according to your agreement with that particular work. It's highly accepted and it's understandable. It's not something very rocket science. So I think this is just criticism. In fact, when you look at the current situation with the COVID-19, when we sit with these meetings, COSATU leading us there, one point is that many small businesses and failing businesses, big businesses, but failing because of COVID-19 and lockdown regulations, it is trade union movement that saved them. To say these people need a funding to assist them to pay workers, not to retrench, which was TRS, which is called TES. Trade union went battling net leg to fight against that, even to the point of extending it now. So in fact, business at this point in time, many have spoken to me in our sector. We have saved them. So it is a very narrow idea to say trade unionists are not killing business. We are now going to engage extensively on the media industry, as I spoke to it earlier on, with the relevant institutions like MDDA. How do you then reimagine the new industries of the media? How do we fund it? How do we help the existing companies to sustain? And that's the role of a trade union movement. So we are so willing to educate those who want to be educated. But unfortunately, not all want to be educated. But let's allow those who want to throw stones at us, will take those stones and build our castle.
I think this is a good point to segue to the benefits that trade unions offer, moving away from the myths discussion we were having. Because one of the things you mentioned is, the massive role, especially in recent years, that trade unions have had in passing important legislation like the minimum wage, or in saving corporates that were on the verge of failure. So if it wasn't for, this pandemic, EdCon would still be around. And the reason why is because COSATU pressured government to bail out EdCon about 2 years ago. Unfortunately, it didn't quite go out as planned, but that's because of the pandemic and you couldn't really predict that sort of thing. It shows the ability, especially in this country, that trade unions have to push for positive legislative change when a lot of the environment in terms of, calling for legislation and government intervention ends up being quite dry. So maybe we could just chat about that from your experience. What have been not just the strict, relationship between worker and employer that the trade union helps facilitate, but in the broader sense of, as you were saying, unions literally saving companies during the pandemic. Could we talk a bit more about that? And, maybe some key examples from your experience?
Well, certainly. One of the, I think there's a massive job that has been done by our trade unions such as SACAU. And I want to repeat on the issue of EdCon. We are still on it. We are still saving it in this current stage. So is not done, is not completely out. In the South African Post Office, for example, we have played a very significant role as communication workers. Since year 2007, we've been calling that social grants must be paid by the state using South African Post Office. What we're basically saying, we're saying that the money that the state is using to pay the major banks that have money, why does the state not pay itself to service its own people and give proper service to them? That's a point one. Leave the corruption a little bit out because things were mingled with corruption. We'll deal with that later. But the point is that the trade union is now saving that company. The second point, we said today they've now advertised as things that it's new ideas. It's basically not new ideas. In 2007, in the COSATU Congress, Communication Workers Union said, let there be ATMs, even though we did not use the term ATM, for medicine delivery. We said post office must deliver medicines to the most poor and the most vulnerable in the outskirts of the rural areas, which today they call it a medication, ATM medication or something. They just do the nice one. But we are saying the poor who queues for a long hours and the clinic, in the hospital, and eventually die there because they are old, why don't you use the very same postman who delivers everywhere to deliver that medication and put the proper money? So we are creating a business for post office not to die. We are revamping the post office to be relevant in the new dispensation. We are also bringing profit into the South African post office than to close our eyes and say, hey, it's all gone, post office is the old thing. It's a number of innovations that we have created around there. So we think that we play that significant role to build these companies inside and outside. Now there's talks about a spectrum that it must be given. We are very worried that the government might move fast and give the duopoly, which is Vodacom and MTN, more spectrum against the newcomers into the field. We are advocating that there should be a whole open access to network, which is called WAN, which will be given to the new role players, particularly the previously disadvantaged. Now, anyone will say that union exists to, make it possible for new business to come. It's a myth. Now we are here, we are saying, bring new players that will compete effectively, that will make sure that a data price drops, because when there's competition, they will be compelled to drop the data prices, the speed of networks must be there, the 5G and so on. So we are in that space. In the absence of the union arguing those points, we will have capitalists talking as they want, taking everything, and the poor remains poor. So you need to build a trade union, but also you need a strong trade union. It's not going to be sustainable to have young people coming from varsity into workplaces and not join trade union. Because if those ideas that must come into the workplaces and also boost the capacity of the trade union, is those young workers with young brilliant mind that must build a new type of a trade union that will take us forward. So unions will die if people fail to read and understand the workplace and understand the industry. So it's very important to do that.
I really like what you were saying about this idea of unions driving innovation in especially your union for the post office and for opening up competition in our cellular industry. Because one of the things that really defines South Africa's economy as unique to ones around the world, well, there's many, but it's firstly our horrific inequality in this country. And secondly, the fact that we are dominated by either state-owned monopolies or in the private sector, oligopolies of just a few companies that control everything. So, as an example, for food retailers, there's like 3 supermarket chains. Yeah, around 3 supermarket chains. And in the cellular industry, there's Telkom, Vodacom, Cell C and MTN, and that's it. So that's like one of the defining parts of our economy. And in a structure like that, where you have such large entities and you don't have that much competition, it can often become easy to ignore the need to innovate because you already have such a large market share. So, so would you agree that, in the place of, the regular competition that economies should be having, and, ideally we should get to that, but in the place that we're in now, is it also a role for trade unions to innovate the economy, especially in these big behemoth organizations that have such large market share that aren't incentivized to innovate? Is that a new role for a trade union to sort of force these big corporations to innovate and to move society forward?
No, I fully agree with you. We need to force our way in terms of driving that. But I think we correctly analyze the role of a trade union. That a trade union becomes, we call that the advanced stratum of the working class, because you're at the heart of the economy. But you then need a political vanguard that will therefore drive the ideological aspect of economy. For example, when we had the tripartite of the ANC, SACP, and the COSATU, we said that the party must lead ideologically in terms of driving what you're talking about, those economic reforms. It's very critical because union can be able to punch holes and weaken the strength of those who own means of production. But ideologically, we have to have them. We must not make a mistake where unions become pseudo-political parties, because it will miss its core function of defending workers at the factory level. So it's very important we do that. Well, we can be challenged that perhaps things are not as working as we planned. Perhaps the tripartite alliance is not working, and so on and so forth. It's a discussion we need to engage on, but perhaps it's not for this forum at this point in time. But I'm saying at the level of putting things into perspective ideologically, that is how we need to follow these things.
You spoke about the tripartite alliance, and I think for the benefit of the audience who are still new in South African politics and are still getting the lay of the land, would you mind just explaining, what the tripartite alliance is? And I know that it started in the struggle as an institution of the struggle, as an alliance between the Communist Party, the ANC, and organized labor. But what is its shape now, and what is its role now in the new South Africa, in the democratic dispensation?
Well, I think significance is very important, fundamental. Why I'm saying that is because the working class from time to time has to form allies with those ruling parties that they share the same ideas and views in terms of advancing the objectives of the poor. You need to form those allies to win certain battles. But you must not be confused with the two, that you think that the elites will pursue the struggle of the poor. It cannot be. But you have to find those common objectives that you have to be able to advance that particular struggle. Amongst many, for example, we have agreed on minimum wage. I think if you had political parties like DA in government, we wouldn't have achieved that, absolutely nothing. Many have been calling, even the midst now of the SABC retrenchment. We are going to the ruling party and say, can you pursue this particular objective? And we find each other alongside other parties that shares a common objective in terms of ideological perspective. So the working class needs from time to time form these allies, but don't be confused to say ultimately the ruling party will pursue the struggle of the working class. It's not going to happen. But you find these allies. So this tripartite alliance becomes very unique and becomes very critical and important. And if you have to look since democracy, right up until now, the most critical voice against ANC has been COSATU. The most critical, you can Google and go as back as you like. COSATU stands there, criticized on a number of things, but it's also COSATU that says this is the closest party that we do have to our views. And so long as that stands, and so long as it's a mandate of workers that says that, it will continue like that. But only when workers change their views around them. I think the most frustrating thing that we need to talk about, it's been an enemy of the working class, is corruption in government, is corruption in the ANC itself. And that has been the enemy of everything that we strive to do. Because corruption also expresses itself everywhere, including the churches. So you cannot isolate it and make it a political thing, including the society in general. When they are stopped by traffic officers, they pay 20 rand instead of getting a ticket for a traffic offense that they've committed. So we need to deal with corruption extensively, but correctly so. I think what we need to advance is that it must start at the top. When the minister is found wanting, they must be locked into a jail and throw the keys away. I think that will change. But at ideological perspective, I think we still have a correct alliance. It still needs to be reshaped and rebuilt in terms of that. But others will say, why don't you move out? As if it's an answer. You move out of a hot pot into a fire. You might find that the most corrupt is the one that you are joining. So you have not fixed the problem. You have just changed the rules from one other room to the other. So it's important that we deal with the core of the society, which is corruption, and deal with that moving forward.
I think that's one of the biggest things that people don't realize about the work that COSATU and all of its affiliate unions under it have done in terms of pressuring the government to, enact essential economic reforms and to, clamp down on corruption. We're only starting to see that, happening now. We've seen in the news about the SIU and Eskom pursuing some of the billions that have been stolen. One of the reasons that that's happened is because organized labor has been such a loud voice against corruption in this country. So I think we've covered a lot of good ground. We've dispelled a lot of the myths about trade unions in South Africa and across the world. We've spoken about why they're essential, especially in our economy, and a lot of the good work that they do. And I think maybe we can wrap up by chatting about some of the work that the Communication Workers Union is doing now in the midst of this global pandemic and where a lot of industries are threatened. So, I don't know, can you just tell us a bit about the space that you're operating in now and what are the big projects that CWU is working on?
Well, indeed, there's been a number of big projects that we embarked on. One amongst others is that we've seen businesses are taking advantage of COVID-19. Every Dim, Tom, and Harry now is pronouncing retrenchment, crying poverty because of COVID-19, even if they don't have substance on what they are talking about. So we've been in the midst of the battle against Telkom to prevent retrenchment. Telkom has been pushing for forceful retrenchment of over 3,000 workers. We pressed them against the wall to a point where they opted to give workers the voluntary package with a certain additional amount. When those workers opted to take a voluntary package, we have Telkom now talking of just above 200 workers to be retrenched now. We are still pushing them back to say you cannot retrench, not at this time. We are fighting SABC. We are saying to SABC, you cannot retrench. We have plans on the table. How do you migrate from the analog to digital broadcasting, create new channels? How do you exploit the areas of the online content so that you create more jobs? At SABC, we are no longer talking about defending jobs. We are saying to the employer, you must start talking about creating more jobs. So those are we are turning the tail in terms of that discussion. But we've engaged with multi-choice. We pushed them against the wall over forceful retrenchment. They went to the point of voluntary packages. So it's a number of companies. And not all the battles we win. Other battles we do suffer some heavy blows, but it's a battle that we need to take on. We are saying now we need to relook at the question of the community radio station. How are they funded? How are they sustained? So that they are able to continue when we talk about the transformation of the broadcasting area. We need to be inclusive of community radio stations. You need to be inclusive of those newspapers that are sold by homeless people. There's a newspaper that is sold by homeless people. How do we assist in making sure that those institutions are protected? And this is the project that CWU is embarking on. On some things that we have not released, we are also looking to the space. How do you help the workers that have been retrenched? We are talking two things. We need to fight in terms of and we are already engaging. It's not just a talk. The MICTA on how to reskill and develop those workers, fund them in terms of the new innovations, new jobs, new skills, so that after they completed their training, they can also be absorbed into the market. But we must not stop there, and this is what CWU is saying. We must look after their immediate responsibility. Like if somebody is get retrenched and there's a child in university, how do we fill that gap in terms of assisting that particular work? So it's a project, it's an ongoing project that we are planning now as a trade union movement. But there's also serious other number of things that we are doing behind the scene. Amongst others is to fight what our courts have changed. Section 189, which is about retrenchment. It's now easier for employer to retrench. We are challenging that matter in court, but we are also made a move in terms of network to say in network through COSATU, there should be an amendment of Section 189 as it stands now, so that it becomes more difficult for the employer to just retrench without any reason. But more so, we are also talking on Section 197, where employers just outsource workers without any reason. At that later stage, they take those workers to the unemployment army. So we have challenged that. It's a matter that is at NetLab. So there's a number of things that the trade union, SCWU doing, but collective as affiliates of COSATU doing, because there are some battles that are mainly industrial. Then you have battles that are actually at the space of the countries itself. We also have to talk about the accessibility to affordability of data. This is an ongoing battle. The poor cannot access data. It's a digital device, a digital economy device, and where we say the rich are still continue to flourish in that space, and the poor continue to struggle to get access. COVID-19 has been one of the things that have highlighted our weaknesses as a society, has exposed us between the haves and the have-not. When we heard about the private schools are going to continue open and the public schools are going to be closed because of accessibility, the compliance and all of those things, it exposes that the poor are still marginalized. And those are some of the things that we need to deal with it in a format of digital device, because even when the time the schools were closed, the private schools were continuing to do the work in terms of education because they have access into these things. Our children in the townships were later in the streets, even not protected from the very same COVID-19 that we are saying that they must stay at home to protect them. So these are the things that we need to drive, and CWU is in the forefront. We've made submissions in ICAS and so on. And so it's a battle, it's an ongoing battle. But what is the most important? The strength of the union remains at the hands of workers. The less workers joining trade union, the weaker the trade unions are. The more we have numbers in terms of affiliation to trade union, the stronger the voice of workers across everyone. And what we like about the trade union, it's a very democratic space. Any person who joins it today, he becomes the owner of that union, because you can replace leader, you can elect any leader of your choice at any given time. So it's very much important that we do have a trade union exist. But more so is that perhaps after the lockdown, we need to open up a discussion about how do you continue to interact with the student at tertiary level and the student at high school level, so that they have a direct interaction with trade union through institutions like SASCO, the EFF Command, the COSAS, and so on and so forth, so that there's a greater understanding and the need of trade unionism going forward.
What young people are told most often about trade unions in this country is that they become a scapegoat to blame for all of our economy's failings. Our GDP is horrible, our unemployment is huge. Who do you blame? You blame the trade union. When in fact, it's most probably the other way around. How bad would things be without the trade unions? In that sense, unionism is the shield that is guarding the South African economy and is keeping it alive. And I think as a host, that is the idea that I would want to leave in my audience's head. That unions are not demons who are there to make your working life hell or to make your business impossible to operate. They are one of the few things that they're some of the few entities that are calling for genuine change in this country and are helping to preserve our economy when it's going through its biggest crisis in maybe its entire history, a decade of crisis. And trade unions are standing firm in protecting our economy. Cool. Thanks, everyone. This has been the Political Field podcast. I've been joined by Comrade Aubrey Tshabalala, the General Secretary of the Communication Workers Union. And we have been discussing the role that trade unions play in our economy. We've been dismissing a lot of the myths about them. We've talked about the ways that they are essential in preserving our economy and in growing it and in innovating it. And lastly, we talked about the different projects that CWU and COSATU are working on, especially during this COVID-19 pandemic, to help our recovery. Thanks, everyone, and stay safe.